Hey there, good evening. Nice to see you. It is time for the Bronx Buzz. This is Bronx Night's program where we talk to reporters, writers, and editors in our first segment. In our second segment, we try to do some arts and culture and things going on in the Bronx. We're going to do that this evening, but we're going to get started with one of our media buddies, and that would be Camille Botello. She's the digital editor for the Bronx Times. Hi, Camille. Nice to see you again.
Yes, thanks for having me back, Gary.
I wanted to we mentioned it just before the show. You're actually from elsewhere and you've come here. When did you start writing for the Bronx Times and working for the Bronx Times? And I know your work has been expanding, which is nice.
Yeah,
What are your impressions of being here in the BX after being from out there?
from all the way out there. Yeah, I'm from the West originally. I actually grew up in Idaho, went to school outside of Portland, Oregon. And then after school, I moved to Alaska. And from Alaska, I moved to New York City. So quite the change. It's been great so far. I've been at the Bronx Times since September of 2022. So just almost a year and a half now, not quite. Um, and it's been great. It's kind of interesting. It almost seems like local news is pretty linear in all the places I've been, whether that's small town Alaska or here in the big city. So it's been great to cover the Bronx, especially because I know we've spoken about how there is a lot of nuance to the Bronx. There are a lot of things that go on that aren't told as much too. So it's been an honor to try to tell some of those stories as well.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I've said this I don't know how many times. It's like sometimes I feel like we're undiscovered territory. You got 1.4
Hmm.
million people here, and nobody knows we're here. Nobody knows we have real lives.
Yeah.
It's kind of wacky. But you, let's just get right to it then. You wrote a piece called "The South Bronx Has Undergone Economic Revitalization: A 20% Increase in Business Activity," according to the state controller. In a way, that's an eye opener because people in the Bronx work so hard, they struggle so hard. So, give us a little summary of the controller's report, and then we'll dig deep into it if we can.
Yeah, that was an interesting one. We had gotten that report, like you said, from the Office of the State Comptroller. A lot of people know that the South Bronx is an area that's historically been underinvested. There's been, especially in the 80s, 90s, there was a lot of arson, a lot of other structural fires, crime, environmental challenges, all those different things, which the comptroller also noted in this most recent report that came out last week. That the South Bronx still needs more investment, especially in the job market front and the affordable housing front. But yeah, it was interesting that the report basically summarized that from the decade of 2011 to 2021, there's been a 20% business activity increase, despite South Bronx being disproportionately affected by the pandemic, and that's compared to 18% citywide, so a little higher than the citywide
It,
average
it,
as
it,
well.
it's very impressive. And of course, one thing which you didn't mention, aside from underinvested and all those other things, is poverty. I mean,
Right.
the congressional district there has been the poorest one, not only in the state but in the country, and
Right.
so that's a fight. The thing that was incredibly interesting to me and hopeful, maybe a way to say it, is that Controller DiNapoli, Tom DiNapoli is the state controller, said that it was he attributed the advancement to the economic resilience to the community.
Hmm.
And that was fascinating to me because we know how hard Bronxites work. We know how we've fought against everything, disinvestment and fires. I mean, we know what happened. But he says we stayed strong, and people have rebounded, and because of that collective strength, have done better. I think that's about as hopeful a thing as I can imagine.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Some of the quotes that we had gotten from the comptroller himself, and then also a lot of Bronx politicians, they noted for sure that a lot of the business activity increase was probably partially due to some of the different grant programs that were handed out during the COVID pandemic, specifically to target small businesses and to help them stay afloat. But yeah, a lot of the people who were quoted and interviewed, including Tom DiNapoli himself, really attributed it to the resiliency of the community. which I think, a lot of people
We
living in the
we
Bronx.
didn't die, we didn't fall. That's right. We
Right.
didn't die, we didn't fall, things didn't collapse, et cetera, et cetera. Were
Hmm.
there,
Exactly.
I guess we there were job losses though. That right? That was one downside, right? That was one thing that happened that would rather
Hmm.
not happen, because one of the ways we're going to continue to do better financially is to get people jobs.
Right. Yeah, there was part of the report also stated that the South Bronx lost about 6,100 jobs that had gained over that decade, 2011 to 2021, which was a 7.7% drop, which was pretty substantial. But then the report stated that the South Bronx actually added back about 4,600 of those jobs in 2022. So, slowly climbing up there, trying to get back those 6,100.
Mhm. And another thing which you implicated but didn't directly mention, the South Bronx was one of the areas that was most devastated by COVID, and that
Hmm.
certainly would not only impact people's lives but would impact the economic environment as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we had reported back during the pandemic actually that the South Bronx lost about 40% of its businesses by February of 2022 as a direct result of the
Yeah.
pandemic. So again, just very devastating all around. But so that's why the report was interesting to show that resilience.
Well, I have to thank you for bringing it to us because, again, like everything else, okay, so there was a report about the Bronx or the South Bronx, and
Hmm.
we wouldn't have seen it. So thank you, and of course our buddies at the Bronx Times for that. One thing, really, to also that was interesting. It can bring us to another point. Is the health of the Hunts Point market? I was trying to think. Well, what businesses have fueled this? And in some ways, and I don't have any numbers toward that in front of me, it's the health of the Hunts Point food market. And you don't want to say so goes the food market, so goes the South Bronx, but that was encouraging as well.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, I'm not from here. I haven't been here for too long, but it seems like that market is pretty integral to that community, and probably by extension, the larger community of the South Bronx as well. And that was one of the things that the comptroller actually mentioned too in the report, that some of the, I think his words were, chronic health, economic, environmental challenges in the South Bronx. Some of the ways that the state or the city is trying to address those is one of them is through the Hunts Point Access Improvement Project, um, which is basically a project to hopefully allow better access to, from that peninsula to the Sheridan and Bruckner expressways for wholesale business trucks. And that's, over $1 billion, that's $1.7 billion project. So that's a big one.
Right. That I recall from the past. That and I kind of lost track of it because it's ongoing. You
Hmm.
don't do road repair and just change it quickly. But that is another good point. I kind of played a cheap trick. In other words, I wanted to segue from that Hunts Point market right into the Peninsula Housing Project, La
Hmm.
Peninsula, that had an advancement. They've done well, so now there's the second phase, which you wrote about. Why don't you talk a little bit, if you would, about the La Peninsula and how does that fit into this whole panorama of economic and personal health in the Bronx?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was a story that I wrote about last week. They announced the developers of this massive housing project in Hunts Point, called the Peninsula. They announced the groundbreaking of phase two, which was the construction of two of the four total residential buildings. And what's interesting and special about these buildings is that they're 100% affordable housing designation. Um, and that's the developers secured almost 300 million, not quite 297 million for phase two of this project last summer. And so those two buildings that are going to go up now are going to join two others that are already on that campus.
And I've dealt with development in the South Bronx for so long, and almost every time something goes up, people say, for want of a better term, there goes the neighborhood because it's something that we can't afford and it's going to gentrify our neighborhoods. And all you got to do is drive down, south on the Deegan and you're looking on one side is public housing and the other side of these luxury buildings. It's kind of like
Right.
it doesn't jive. But this project seems to be one that is not going to go in that direction. I got the numbers from your report. 73% will be rented at below 60% of the median AMI, which is a tricky thing, but that's a pretty big number. And the other 15% slated to be reserved for formerly homeless, which also is an answer to problems.
Right.
I didn't ask you a question. I'm just saying this sounds to me like good news compared to a lot of the other projects that are going up right there.
Yeah, like you said, the South Bronx is kind of an interesting place right now, especially perhaps Hunts Point, because it is one of the last, we've had some reporting on this as well from a former colleague. It is one of the last kind of developable waterfront communities in New York City. And, a lot of people say that it is gentrifying, but projects like this, I think, at least, developers and Bronx politicians would say that they, are trying to help the housing crisis, the greater housing crisis, not just in the South Bronx, but in the Bronx and the city in general.
We've got about a minute and a half, and I want to ask you, so what do you got coming up? Got something interesting? You're always working. And I want to tell folks in the Bronx, the reporters and the people at the Bronx Times these days have been working their tails off because I know them well. And every time I call them, they say, we're busy this week. So what do you got? I know you're working on something.
Yeah, I'm actually doing a follow-up story now that I think should run for this Friday's paper about some unclaimed funds, public funds that have been reported on by the comptroller's office as well in the Bronx, which should be a good one, another economic story. And then a coworker and I, Stephen Goodstein, if you've spoken to him.
Let me just add one thing about that. I'm sorry. I have seen it happen that people have unclaimed funds and it turns out to be like real money. I once had it and I think I got, $14 or something, but I've seen people get hundreds or even more money. So take that seriously. Okay, so that's one. And what's the other one?
Yeah, that'll be a good one. And then my coworker, Stephen Goodstein, and I are working on sort of a longer form feature about basketball in the Bronx. So that'll be something good to look forward to. Yeah, I'm excited for that one.
Basketball in the Bronx, we have that.
Yes,
he said
lot of it.
With tongue in cheek.
Yeah.
Listen, that's fantastic. By the way, you mentioned Steve. Listen, we can be chatty on this program. Tell Steve I want to invite him for the next recording session. So
okay, perfect.
A couple of weeks. I know he's back at the paper now, and I know him from the past. But just tell him I'm going to contact him. We want to have him. Listen, Camille, digital editor over there at the Bronx Times, and she just does great work. And you heard examples of it just now. Without her, how would we know? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks
happy
for having
holidays
me.
to you and yes, of course, and to you and all my buddies over there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. You as well.
Great. Okay, let's take a short break. When we come back, Art in the Bronx, the Riverdale Art Festival. We'll be right back.